Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his leather office chair, the glow of his laptop screen casting sharp shadows across his chiseled face. At 38, he was the kind of man who turned heads without trying. Dark hair swept back just so, piercing blue eyes that could cut through steel, and a jawline that looked like it was carved by a sculptor with a grudge. He was the CEO of Quantum Tech, a tech empire he'd built from scratch, and he wore his success like a tailored suit, perfectly fitted, no room for error. Work was his religion, and emotions, those were for people who had time to waste. He didn't. Across the room, Maya Harper sat at her desk, her fingers flying over her keyboard as she finalized his schedule. At 29, she was a quiet force, smooth brown skin that glowed under the office lights, warm brown eyes that held a spark of something deeper, and curly hair that bounced with every move she made. She'd been Ethan's personal assistant for 3 years, and in that time she'd become his shadow. She knew his coffee order black, no sugar, his meeting habits, short and brutal, and the way he'd tap his pen when he was annoyed, which was often. What he didn't know was how her heart skipped every time he walked by, how she'd memorized the sound of his voice, or how she'd fallen for him somewhere between late-night emails and early morning briefings. Ethan glanced up from his screen, his eyes narrowing at the email he'd just opened. "Maya," he said, his voice low and clipped. "We're heading to Willow Creek tomorrow. Quantum Tech's buying out that startup, Nexlify. I want the deal done by the end of the week." Maya nodded, already pulling up the details. "I've got the flight booked for 8 a.m., a rental car waiting, and a meeting with their CEO at noon. Hotel's confirmed too. A small place, but it's the best they've got out there." Her tone was calm, efficient, the way he liked it. She didn't mention how she'd stayed up past midnight to make it all seamless. That wasn't her style. "Good," Ethan said, shutting his laptop with a snap. He stood, stretching his broad shoulders, his dark sweater hugging his frame. "This deal's big, no mistakes." His eyes flicked to her for a split second, long enough for her to feel it in her chest, but then he was gone, striding out of the office like a man who owned the world, which, in a way, he did. Maya let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She pushed a curl behind her ear and stared at the empty doorway. 3 years of working for Ethan, and she still couldn't shake the ache. He was brilliant, driven, impossibly handsome, and completely out of reach. She'd seen the women who threw themselves at him, models, executives, heiresses, and he'd brushed them all off like lint on his sleeve. Love to Ethan was a distraction, a liability, and Maya, she was just the girl who kept his life running like clockwork, nothing more. Still, she couldn't help the way her mind wandered sometimes, the way his rare half-smiles made her stomach flip, the way his voice softened just barely when he thanked her for pulling off the impossible. She shook her head, shoving those thoughts down deep. Tomorrow was a big day. She'd focus on the job, like always. The next morning, they met at the airport. Ethan was in a black coat, his breath visible in the chilly dawn air, looking every bit the untouchable Titan. Maya wore a fitted gray jacket and jeans, her curls pulled back in a loose bun, a leather bag slung over her shoulder. She handed him a coffee, black, no sugar, and he took it without a word, his fingers brushing hers for a heartbeat. She pretended not to notice the jolt it sent through her. The flight was short, and by 10 a.m. they were in a sleek rental SUV winding through the back roads toward Willow Creek. The sky was gray, heavy with clouds, and a few snowflakes dusted the windshield. Ethan kept his eyes on his tablet, reviewing Nexlify's financials, while Maya drove, her hands steady on the wheel. "Weather is getting worse," she said, glancing at the thickening snow. "Might slow us down." Ethan didn't look up. "We'll make it. This deal's not waiting." She bit her lip but said nothing. That was Ethan, always pushing forward, damn the consequences. She admired it, even if it drove her crazy sometimes. The road twisted through pine forests, the trees bowing under the weight of fresh snow, and Willow Creek came into view, a sleepy little town with wooden houses, smoke curling from chimneys, and a single stoplight blinking lazily in the wind. They pulled up to a small office building where Defies' team waited. The meeting was quick, Ethan's specialty. He laid out the terms, his voice sharp and commanding, and within an hour the handshake was done. Papers would be signed tomorrow, once the lawyers finalized everything. Maya stood by his side, taking notes, handing him files, her presence as steady as ever. He didn't say it, but she knew he relied on her. That was enough. For now. As they stepped outside, the snow was falling harder, the wind picking up. Ethan frowned at the sky, his breath clouding in the cold. "Let's get to the hotel," he said, already heading for the car. Maya followed, her boots crunching on the fresh powder, her heart thudding for reasons she couldn't quite name. They didn't know it yet, but the storm was just beginning, and it was about to change everything. The windshield wipers slapped back and forth, fighting a losing battle against the snow as Maya gripped the steering wheel. The road out of Willow Creek was a blur of white, the SUV's headlights barely cutting through the thickening storm. Ethan sat beside her, his tablet forgotten on his lap, his blue eyes narrowed at the chaos outside. The deal was done. Well, almost. And he'd been ready to call it a day, but the weather had other plans. "This is getting bad," Maya said, her voice steady despite the way her knuckles whitened on the wheel. "We might not make it to the hotel." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Keep going, it's only a few miles." She didn't argue, but her eyes flicked to the dashboard clock, 4:37 p.m., then back to the road. The snow was piling up fast, and the wind howled like it was trying to shove the car off course. She'd seen Ethan push through worse, meetings that ran all night, deals that teetered on collapse. But this wasn't a boardroom. This was nature, and it didn't care about his deadlines. A mile later, the inevitable happened. The tires skidded on a patch of ice, and the SUV lurched to a stop, half buried in a snowbank. Maya let out a quiet curse, her breath fogging in the cold air creeping into the car. Ethan unbuckled his seatbelt and leaned forward, peering out the window. "Great," he muttered, his voice dripping with irritation. He pulled out his phone, holding it up like a lifeline. "No signal. You?" Maya checked hers. "Nothing." He shoved the phone back into his pocket, his frustration palpable. "We can't stay here, it's freezing." She nodded, scanning the horizon. Through the swirling snow, she spotted a faint glow, a building, maybe half a mile back. "There's something that way, a house or an inn. We can walk." Ethan's eyes followed her gaze, then flicked back to her. For a second, she thought he'd argue, insist on waiting it out, stubborn as always. But he just nodded. "Fine, grab your stuff." They stepped out into the storm, the wind biting at their faces. Ethan pulled his coat tighter, his dark hair already dusted with snow, while Maya slung her bag over her shoulder and tucked her chin into her scarf. The snow was up to their shins, each step a slog, but they pushed forward, side by side. She stole a glance at him, his broad shoulders hunched against the cold, his expression grim, and felt a flicker of something she could. He was out of his element, and for once, she was the one leading. The glow turned out to be a small inn, its wooden sign creaking in the wind. Willow Rest. A single light burned in the window, warm and inviting against the gray-white mess outside. Maya reached the door first, shoving it open, and a blast of heat hit them as they stumbled inside. The lobby was tiny, wooden walls, a worn rug, a crackling fireplace in the corner. An older woman with gray hair and a knitted sweater looked up from behind the counter, her eyes widening. "Good Lord, you two look half frozen," she said, bustling over. "Caught in the storm, huh?" "Yeah," Ethan said, brushing snow off his sleeves. "Car's stuck. Got any rooms?" The woman, Edna, her name tag read, winced. Just one left. Small, though. One bed, fireplace, not much else. Storm's got everyone holed up. Maya's stomach flipped. One room, one bed. She glanced at Ethan, but his face was unreadable, all business as usual. "We'll take it," he said, pulling out his wallet. "Anything's better than the car." Edna handed them a key, her eyes lingering on Ethan a little too long. Probably not used to seeing someone like him in a place like this. "Up the stairs, last door on the right. There's a bottle of wine in there, on the house. You'll need it to warm up." "Thanks," Maya said, offering a small smile as she took the key. Ethan was already heading for the stairs and she followed, her boots leaving wet prints on the wood. The room was as promised, small, cozy, with a single bed under a quilt, a wooden chair, and a fireplace that was already lit, casting flickering shadows across the walls. A bottle of red wine sat on a rickety table, two mismatched glasses beside it. Maya dropped her bag by the door, rubbing her hands together to shake off the chill. Ethan stood by the fire, his coat draped over the chair, his sweater clinging to his frame as he stared into the flames. "Could have been worse," she said, breaking the silence. "At least we're not stuck out there." He grunted, not turning around. "Could have been better if the damn road hadn't iced over." She rolled her eyes, used to his grumbling. "Well, it's done now. Might as well make the best of it." She crossed to the table, picking up the wine bottle. "Want a glass? Edna's orders." Ethan finally looked at her, his blue eyes catching the firelight. For a beat, he just stared, longer than he ever had before, and she felt her cheeks heat up under his gaze. "Sure," he said at last, his voice softer than usual. "Why not?" She poured 2 glasses, the deep red liquid glugging into the silence, and handed him one. Their fingers brushed again, just like at the airport, and this time she couldn't ignore the spark that shot up her arm. He took a sip, his eyes still on her, and she wondered if he felt it too. Probably not. This was Ethan, ice-cold, untouchable Ethan. Right? They sat in the chair, her on the edge of the bed, sipping wine as the fire popped and the wind howled outside. The room felt smaller with every passing minute, the air thick with something unspoken. Maya tucked her legs under her, cradling her glass. "Ever been stuck like this before?" she asked, just to fill the quiet. "No," he said, leaning back. "First time. You?" "Once. College road trip. Car broke down in the middle of nowhere. We survived on granola bars for 2 days." He raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Granola bars. Resourceful?" She laughed, a little too loud, the wine loosening her nerves. "Yeah, well, I'm full of surprises." His smirk faded, and his eyes locked on hers again, sharper this time. "I'm starting to see that." Her breath caught. Was he flirting? No. Couldn't be. She took another sip, bigger this time, and stared at the fire to avoid his gaze. But she could feel it, his attention, heavy and unfamiliar, like he was seeing her for the first time. The wine warmed her chest, and the room seemed to shrink even more, the space between them buzzing with something she couldn't name. Outside, the storm raged on, sealing them in, and inside something was shifting, slowly, quietly, but undeniably. The fire crackled in the small room, its warm glow painting the wooden walls with shifting gold. Maya sat on the edge of the bed, her wineglass half empty, her curls spilling loose from their bun as she stared into the flames. The storm outside was a dull roar now, muffled by the thick walls of the inn, but inside, the silence between her and Ethan felt louder than ever. He was still in the chair, one leg crossed over the other, his glass dangling from his fingers like he'd forgotten it was there. The wine had softened the edges of the night, and maybe something else too. She glanced at him, catching the way the firelight danced across his face, his sharp cheekbones, the shadow of stubble on his jaw, those blue eyes that usually cut through everything but now seemed different. Softer, maybe. Or was that just the wine talking? She took another sip, the warmth spreading through her chest, and decided to test the waters. So, she said, her voice light, 3 years working for you, and I don't think we've ever talked about anything that's not work. What's your deal, Ethan? Outside the office, I mean. He looked at her, one eyebrow arching slightly, like he wasn't sure if she was serious. My deal? Yeah, hobbies, family, something that doesn't involve spreadsheets or hostile takeovers. She smiled, teasing just a little, hoping he'd bite. He leaned back, swirling the wine in his glass, his gaze drifting to the fire. Not much to tell. Grew up in Boston. Parents split when I was a kid. Built quantum tech from nothing. That's it. She tilted her head, resting her chin on her hand. Come on, there's gotta be more than that. What do you do when you're not being the big bad CEO? His lips twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. Sleep, run, read, sometimes. History stuff, mostly. Boring, right? Not boring, she said, surprised he'd even answered. History's cool. I wouldn't have pegged you for it, though. I thought you'd be all about tech manuals or something. He chuckled, a low sound that caught her off guard. Tech manuals are for work. History's, I don't know, keeps me grounded. What about you? She blinked. Ethan Caldwell asking about her? This was new territory. She set her glass down on the table, tucking a curl behind her ear. Me? I grew up in Philly. Single mom, 2 little brothers. Worked my way through college, waiting tables. Wanted to be a writer once. Novels, stories, that kind of thing. But life got in the way. He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. A writer? Why'd you stop? She shrugged, looking down at her hands. Mom got sick for a while. Brothers needed me. Dreams don't pay bills, you know. Then I landed the job with you, and here we are. He didn't say anything for a moment, just watched her, his expression unreadable. The fire popped, sending a spark skittering across the hearth, and she felt his gaze like a weight. You're good at what you do, he said finally, his voice quieter than before. Better than good. Her cheeks warmed and she waved a hand, brushing it off. Just keeping the machine running. You're the one who makes it all happen. He shook his head, setting his glass down with a soft clink. No, you make it happen. I'd be lost without you, Maya. Her breath hitched. He'd never said anything like that before, not in 3 years. She met his eyes, and there it was again. That shift, that something she couldn't pin down. The wine buzzed in her veins, loosening her tongue. Careful, Ethan. That almost sounds like a compliment. It is, he said, and this time he didn't look away. His gaze held hers, steady and intense, like he was seeing her for the first time. Not the assistant who handed him coffee or fixed his schedule, but her. Maya, the woman who'd been right in front of him all along. She swallowed, her heart thudding against her ribs. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, the fire's heat pressing in around them. He stood, slow and deliberate, crossing the short distance to the bed. Her pulse jumped as he sat beside her, not too close, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, smell the faint cedar of his cologne mixing with the wine on his breath. You're full of surprises, huh? He said, his voice low, almost a murmur. His eyes flicked over her face, her curls, her lips, back to her eyes, and she couldn't breathe right. Guess so, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't move, couldn't, pinned by the weight of his stare. And then his hand moved. Slow, tentative, brushing against hers where it rested on the quilt. His fingers lingered, rough against her skin, and her stomach flipped. Maya, he said, her name soft on his lips, like he was tasting it for the first time. She looked up, and his eyes were darker now, the blue swallowed by something raw, something hungry. Before she could process it, He leaned in, his hand sliding to her wrist, and then his lips were on hers. It wasn't gentle, it was sudden, fierce, like a dam breaking. She gasped against his mouth, her hands flying to his chest, fingers curling into his sweater as he kissed her harder. He tasted like wine and heat, and she melted into it, her head spinning, her body igniting. His hand slid to her cheek, tilting her face as he deepened the kiss, his tongue brushing hers with a hunger that stole her breath. She pulled back just enough to catch her air, her lips tingling, her heart slamming in her chest. "Ethan!" "Don't," he said, his voice rough, his forehead pressing against hers. "Don't say anything, just—" He kissed her again, slower this time but no less intense, his hand sliding to the back of her neck, pulling her closer. She didn't fight it, couldn't. Years of wanting him, of hiding it, poured out in that moment, and she kissed him back with everything she had. The fire roared beside them, but it was nothing compared to the heat building between them. His hands roamed, her shoulders, her waist, pulling her against him, and she let herself fall, let the wine and the storm and the impossible closeness of him sweep her away. The bed creaked as they sank into it, his weight pressing over her, his lips trailing fire down her jaw, her neck. She clutched at him, her fingers digging into his back, and for once, he wasn't the untouchable CEO, he was just Ethan, hers, at least for tonight. Hours later, the fire had burned low, a faint glow flickering across the room. Maya lay tangled in the quilt, her head on his chest, his arm draped over her waist. His breathing was slow, steady, but she knew he wasn't asleep. Neither was she. The storm still raged outside, but inside, everything had changed. She tilted her head, looking up at him. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, his jaw tight. "You okay?" she whispered. He didn't answer right away, just ran his fingers absently through her curls. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "Just didn't expect this." She smiled faintly, resting her chin on his chest. "Me neither." He looked down at her then, his blue eyes softer than she'd ever seen them, and something twisted in her chest. This wasn't just a moment. It was more. She could feel it. But what it meant, she didn't know. Not yet. Morning came too soon, gray light seeping through the curtains. The storm had eased, the wind a distant hum. Ethan stirred beside her, his arm tightening around her for a second before he sat up, running a hand through his hair. He didn't say anything, just looked at her, long and quiet, and she felt the weight of it all over again. "We should get moving," he said at last, his voice rough with sleep. "Roads might be clear." She nodded, sitting up, the quilt pooling around her. "Yeah, deal's not done yet." He smirked, just a little, and stood, pulling on his sweater. But as she watched him, she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger than the deal was hanging between them now, something neither of them could walk away from. The snow had stopped falling by the time Ethan and Maya stepped out of the inn, the morning air sharp and biting. The world was blanketed in white, the town of Willow Creek glittering under a pale sun. Maya tugged her jacket tighter, her boots crunching on the packed snow as she followed Ethan back to the SUV. It took some digging, Ethan swearing under his breath as he shoveled snow with a borrowed spade. But they got it free, the engine rumbling to life like a reluctant beast. Neither of them said much on the drive back to the village center, but the silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy, charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. Ethan kept his eyes on the road, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on his thigh. Maya stole glances at him. His dark hair still tousled from the night before, his jaw set in that familiar, determined line. Last night had been real, hadn't it? The way he'd kissed her, held her, whispered her name like it was the only word he knew. It wasn't a dream. But now, in the daylight, she couldn't tell what he was thinking. Was he regretting it? pushing it aside like a file he'd finished with. Her stomach twisted at the thought. They reached the next LaFi office by 9 a.m., the small building buzzing with lawyers and execs ready to finalize the buyout. Ethan slipped back into CEO mode effortlessly. Sharp suit, sharper words, shaking hands and signing papers with the precision of a man who never second-guessed himself. Maya stood by his side, handing him documents, nodding at the right moments, her calm exterior hiding the chaos in her chest. Every time his hand brushed hers, her pulse jumped, but his face gave nothing away. Business as usual. Maybe that was it. Maybe last night was just a blip, a glitch in his system. The deal closed by noon, the room emptying out with murmurs of congratulations. Ethan leaned back in his chair, loosening his tie, a rare flicker of satisfaction crossing his face. "Done," he said, glancing at her. "Good work, Maya." She smiled, small and tight. "You too." He stood, grabbing his coat, and nodded toward the door. "Come on, let's get some air." She followed him outside, the cold slapping her cheeks as they stepped onto the snow-dusted street. The village was quiet now, the storm's aftermath leaving it hushed and still. They walked past quaint shops and frost-covered trees, their breaths puffing in the air. Ethan's hands were shoved in his pockets, his shoulders tense, and she wondered if he'd say anything about last night, or if she'd have to. He stopped suddenly under a massive oak, its branches heavy with snow, and turned to her. His blue eyes locked on hers, intense and searching, and her heart thudded so hard she thought it might crack a rib. "Maya," he said, his voice low, rougher than usual. "About last night." She braced herself, ready for the letdown. It was a mistake, we should forget it. But he stepped closer, his hand reaching for hers. His fingers were cold, but his grip was firm, anchoring her in place. "I don't know what the hell I'm doing," he said, his breath clouding between them. "I've spent years keeping everything locked down, work, life, all of it. No distractions, no... this." He squeezed her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "But you've been there, right in front of me, and I was too damn blind to see it." Her lips parted, but no words came. He kept going, his voice dropping lower, rawer. "Last night wasn't just the wine or the storm. It was you. I can't stop thinking about you, Maya. I don't want to stop." Her chest tightened, a lump rising in her throat. "Ethan, Wait," he cut in, stepping even closer, his free hand lifting to her cheek. "I'm not good at this, never have been, but I want you, not just for a night, for real. Marry me." The world tilted. She stared at him, his face inches from hers, his eyes blazing with something she'd never seen before. Vulnerability, need, love. "What?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "Marry me," he said again, firmer this time, like he'd made up his mind and wouldn't back down. "I'm done pretending I don't need you. I do. Every day." Tears stung her eyes, her heart racing so fast it hurt. She wanted to say yes, God, she'd wanted this for years, but there was something he didn't know, something she'd buried deep. And now, with him standing there, bearing his soul under a snow-laden tree, it clawed its way up, demanding to be heard. "Ethan," she said, her voice trembling, "there's something I need to tell you first." He frowned, his hand stilling on her cheek. "What?" She took a shaky breath, pulling back just enough to meet his gaze. "When I started working for you, it wasn't an accident. I was hired by someone else, Technova, your biggest rival. They wanted me to get close, dig up dirt, anything they could use against you. I was supposed to be a spy." His face went blank, his hand dropping to his side. The air between them turned cold, sharper than the wind. "What?" he said again, but this time it was hard, edged with disbelief. "I didn't do it," she rushed on, tears spilling now. "I couldn't. I got the job, yeah, but the first week, the first day, I saw who you were. Not the cold bastard they said you'd be, but someone brilliant, someone worth believing in. I quit them, Ethan. I stayed because I wanted to, not because they paid me, and then I fell for you. For real." He stared at her, his jaw tight, his eyes dark and unreadable. She could see the gears turning, the betrayal sinking in, and it broke her. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, wiping at her face. "I should have told you sooner. I get it if you hate me now, if you—" "Stop." His voice cut through her like a blade. He stepped back, running a hand through his hair, his breath coming fast. "You were, what, a plant? All this time?" "No," she said, desperate. "Not all this time. Just the beginning. After that it was me. Me, Ethan. Everything I've done for you. Everything I feel. It's real. Last night was real." He didn't speak, just looked at her, his face a storm of anger and hurt. She waited, her heart in her throat, the silence stretching into eternity. Then, finally, he exhaled, long and ragged, and stepped toward her again. "You should have told me," he said, his voice low, strained. "But I don't hate you." She blinked, tears blurring her vision. "You don't?" "No." He reached for her hand again, slower this time, like he was testing himself. "I've spent my life not trusting anyone, Maya. Built walls so high nothing could get through. And you got through anyway. Spy or not, you're the only one who ever has." Her breath hitched, relief crashing over her like a wave. "So? What does that mean?" "It means I'm pissed," he said, a faint bitter smile tugging at his lips. "But it also means I still want you, more than anything." He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, his chin resting on her head. "You're mine, Maya, messed up past and all." She buried her face in his chest, sobbing quietly, her hands clutching his coat. "I'm yours," she whispered. "Always have been." He tilted her chin up, kissing her hard, possessive, like he was claiming her all over again. The snow crunched under their feet, the world fading away, and she knew they'd survived the storm, both outside and in. The air in Willow Creek felt lighter now, the snow melting into patches of green as spring crept in. It had been 3 months since the storm, since Ethan's proposal and Maya's confession under that oak tree. 3 months of late-night talks, quiet apologies, and a love that grew stronger with every honest word. Today, the little town buzzed with something new, excitement. Ethan Caldwell, the tech titan who'd once breezed through like a cold wind, was getting married, and not just anywhere, but right here, where it all began. The chapel sat at the edge of the village, a small stone building with ivy climbing its walls and stained glass windows that caught the morning sun. White roses lined the cobblestone path, their petals swaying in the breeze, and a crowd gathered, tech moguls in sharp suits mixing with locals in their Sunday best. Ethan stood at the altar, his black tuxedo hugging his broad frame, his dark hair slicked back just enough to tame it. His hands were clasped in front of him, but his fingers twitched, betraying the nerves he'd never admit to. His blue eyes kept darting to the chapel doors, waiting. Maya had insisted on this place. "It's where we found each other," she'd said one night, curled up against him on their couch back in the city. He hadn't argued. Truth was, he'd marry her anywhere. Here, a courthouse, a damn parking lot, as long as she was his. After her confession, he'd wrestled with it for days, the sting of her secret cutting deep. But every time he looked at her, those warm brown eyes, that quiet strength, he knew she was worth it. She'd chosen him, not Technova, not the past. And he'd chosen her right back. The music swelled, a soft violin melody filling the chapel, and the doors creaked open. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as Maya stepped inside, framed by sunlight. She was stunning, her white gown flowing like silk, the lace bodice clinging to her curves before spilling into a train that shimmered faintly. Her curls were loose, cascading over her shoulders, a delicate veil pinned with tiny pearls. Her father walked beside her, his arm steady under hers, but her eyes, those deep, soulful brown eyes, locked on Ethan's, and he forgot how to breathe. She reached him, her father kissing her cheek before stepping back, and Ethan took her hand, his grip tight, like he was afraid she'd vanish. "You're beautiful," he whispered, his voice rough, meant just for her. Her cheeks flushed, a shy smile breaking through. "You clean up pretty good yourself." The priest cleared his throat, his voice warm as he began, but Ethan barely heard it. His world was her hand in his, the faint tremble in her fingers, the way her lips parted as she listened. When it was time for the vows, he turned to face her fully, his heart pounding. "Maya," he said, his voice low but steady, carrying through the quiet chapel. "I built my life on control, on keeping everyone out, on never needing anyone. Then you came along and you wrecked it all. You saw me, the real me, when I didn't even know who that was. You made me feel things I didn't think I could. Trust, hope, love. I'm not perfect, and I've got a hell of a temper, but I promise you this. I'll spend every day loving you, protecting you, making sure you never doubt what you mean to me. You're my everything." Her eyes shimmered with tears, her hands squeezing his as she blinked them back. She took a breath, her voice soft but clear when she spoke. "Ethan, you were this force, this man I thought I'd never reach, but you let me in, past all those walls, and you showed me a heart I didn't expect. You taught me what it means to be wanted, to be seen. I promise to stand by you, to fight for us, to remind you every day that you're not alone anymore. I love you. Always will." His throat tightened, and for a second he thought he might lose it right there in front of everyone. The priest smiled, holding out the rings. Ethan slid the band onto her finger, his touch lingering as he said, "With this, you're mine forever." Her hand shook as she slipped his ring on, her voice barely a whisper. "And with this, you're mine." "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the priest said, his grin widening. "You may—" Ethan didn't wait. He pulled her into his arms, his hands framing her face as he kissed her. Deep, slow, like the world could wait. Her arms wrapped around his neck, her lips soft and warm against his, and the chapel erupted in cheers. When he pulled back, his forehead pressed to hers, he murmured, "You're stuck with me now, Mrs. Caldwell." She laughed, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Good. I wouldn't have it any other way." They turned to face the crowd, hand in hand, and stepped outside into a shower of white petals. The sun was higher now, casting a golden glow over the village, and Ethan's arm slid around her waist, pulling her close as they walked down the path. Guests clapped and shouted, cameras flashed from a distance, but all he saw was her, his wife, his partner, the woman who'd undone him in a snowbound inn. Later, at the reception in a barn just outside town, the mood was warm and loose. String lights twinkled overhead, tables groaned under plates of food, and a band played something soft and twangy. Ethan stood by the bar, a whiskey in hand, watching Maya laugh with a group of locals. She'd kicked off her heels, her gown swaying as she moved, and he couldn't take his eyes off her. She caught his gaze and smiled, that smile that still hit him like a punch, and made her way over. "Having fun?" she asked, leaning into him, her hand resting on his chest. "More than I thought," he said, setting his glass down to pull her closer. "You?" "Best day of my life," she said, her eyes shining. "You?" He smirked, brushing a curl from her face. "Same. But it's not over yet." She raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" "When we get back to the city," he said, his voice dropping, "I want more nights with you. Every night. Starting with a honeymoon somewhere warm. No snow, I promise." She laughed, bright and free, and pressed up on her toes to kiss him. He kissed her back, softer this time, his hand sliding to the small of her back. The music shifted, and he pulled her onto the dance floor, her body fitting against his like it was made to. They swayed, the world fading to just them, and he knew this was it. The life he hadn't known he wanted, the love he'd almost missed, and he'd never let it go. A year had slipped by since the wedding, and the city skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Ethan and Maya's penthouse. Inside, the air was warm, soft, with the scent of cedar and the faint hum of a lullaby. Maya sat on the couch, her curls tied back, cradling a tiny bundle in her arms. Their son Liam was 6 weeks old, dark hair like his dad, warm brown eyes like his mom, and a yawn that could melt anyone. She brushed a finger over his cheek, her heart full in a way she'd never imagined. Ethan stepped into the room, his sleeves rolled up, glasses perched on his nose from hours of late-night work. He'd cut back since Liam arrived. Quantum tech still thrived, but he was home more, present in a way he'd never been before. He crossed to the couch, sinking down beside her, his arms sliding around her shoulders. "He asleep?" he whispered, peering at the baby. "Almost," Maya said, leaning into him. "He's got your stubborn streak, fighting it." Ethan chuckled, low and quiet, his hand resting over hers on Liam's blanket. "Takes after you too. Look at that face." She smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. The fire crackled in the hearth, a sleek, modern one, but it still reminded her of that night in Willow Creek, the night that changed everything. Ethan kissed her temple, his lips lingering. "You've given me everything, Maya," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "A family, a home." She turned to him, her eyes soft. "And you've given me you. That's more than enough." He pulled her closer, their son nestled between them, and in that quiet moment, Ethan knew his world was complete.